That is right. Today it's time to look at this. This is the Asustor LockerStor Gen 3, the 4-bay model for that matter, but there is a 6-bay, an 8-bay, and I believe a 10-bay, if not out already, than on the horizon. And I'll say right now, with this series, before we can get into the weeds of this review, this thing left me ridiculously impressed. I am someone that has followed the Asustor brand for a while, and notwithstanding, I'm more than happy to say this is the best Asustor NAS I've ever seen, and yes, I include the flash store in that. But I will say this has really challenged a lot of the things in the network attached storage industry that I have considered normal. Performance, the cost of certain network connections, ultimately what you should get for your money. Before we even get into anything, we've got to get that elephant in the room out the way, and that is the price tag of this. This is the Gen 3 of the LockerStor series. It's been the LockerStor, the Gen 2 LockerStor, and this. And I'll say right now, the price has gone effing vertical. It went from a system that was retailing at around the 500 to 600 nicker mark in a 4-bay to this one that's currently $1,299. I've seen it listed in some places at $11.99 and some a little higher, profit margin, tax, etc. But straight away, that is a high price tag. And I think a lot of you are going to be wondering, really? That's a big hike up. Does this really, scale things up according to that price? And I will say, for the most part, yes. I will say in terms of hardware, this isn't just greater than the LockerStor 2 that came before it. This thing is a completely different beast. I assume the brand is going to be running these two systems parallel. Now, what do you get for your money? That 1299 nicker there, well, you get for starters a V3000 AMD embedded Ryzen processor, 4-core, 8-core processor there that can go up pretty darn high. We'll talk more about that later on. Alongside that, you get 16 gig of ECC memory. That is right, DDR5 ECC memory. So you've got your on-die ECC built into DDR5, but then you've got ECC as well built into the memory here, pretty much ensuring that some of those faster transfers are going to be squeaky clean there. On the rear of the system, we have got not only 10 gig Ethernet ports, 2 of them copper for that matter, but you've also got 2 5 gig network ports there as well. So you're already ranked up to there a potential 30 gigabits per second or 3 gigabytes per second there, and it supports SMB multi-channel along with the multitude of file services that you're used to. Now, as if it doesn't end there, this system also arrives with 2 USB 4 ports, and they ain't just USB 4 for storage. These USB 4 ports there can be utilized as Thunderbolt over IP or IP over Thunderbolt. Ultimately, what that means is if you are running a Thunderbolt 4 or USB 4 client system, Mac or Windows, you can interface directly into this device and get 20 gigabits per second from each of those connections. You are hearing me right. That means if you add this up, this system has got 10 gig, 10 gig, it's got a 5 gig, 5 gig, and it's got 2 20 gig ports there on the rear, and we'll talk about performance later on. Now, in terms of design, they haven't changed that much over its predecessor in the LockerStor Gen 2. It's a largely similar chassis, as you can see there side by side. It's a plastic front mounted, but the rest of the chassis is completely metal on practically every single side. There's also there on the front an LCD panel, and again, I've given them a lot of compliments for this in the past, but it's worth reminding you that you can configure and initialize this device just using that panel. There's a mobile app, there's client stuff, you can do it in the web browser, but the fact that you can set up this device utilizing the front buttons on it is going to be tremendously helpful. Also, I still love NASes that have got LCD panels, whether it's the kind of Unify or the QNAPs of this world that have got front mounted information, or ones like this, and indeed going back to Unify there, that allow you to configure options and action choices. It isn't just a digital display, it is a control panel. Huge difference there. The system arrives with a fairly standard 90 watt external barrel PSU, and during power consumption testing on this, we saw during idle 30 to 31, close to 32 watts when the system was in idle, but when the system was between 30 and 40% utilization, going all the way up to 50 at one point, we saw it starting out around 38 watts, going into 41 watts, and then hovering around the 50 watt there. Those are pretty darn good numbers. I'm going to say right now, I'm not going to say they're incredible, but I'll say for a 4-core 8-thread processor and 4 drives and 4 NVMe slots inside that I was accessing simultaneously, Power consumption at around 50 watt was hugely impressive. Again, that wasn't utilising the full complement of this system, but it was around 30 to 50% constant utilisation, and you know, it left me impressed. In terms of active cooling, the system has ventilation on 2 of the sides. There's also ventilation holes that run all the way through, built into each of the individual trays there, and there's a 120mm rear fan there, but that isn't just it. Clearly, during the development of this product, they have had to deal with temperatures. This is a bigger, deeper and heavier CPU than they've used in previous generations, and also the M.2s inside are Gen 4 there. So the result is heat is going to be a factor because you're cramming so much into this, notwithstanding those network connections that a lot of the time there isn't going to be the airflow in a lot of those locations to get the air through this system and dissipate that heat. So in the rear of the system, they've actually created a copper thinned pipeline that runs from the CPU through and threaded through the component out towards that rear fan there to assist a lot of that dissipating heat. It's not the first time we've seen copper piping in a NAS, but they definitely rejigged the entire design inside this to compensate for these beefed up components. In terms of storage, of course, we've got the 4 SATA bases mentioned earlier on, supporting 2.5 inch and 3.5 inch SATA media. Again, combined SATA and data connectors on the inside there, fairly standard stuff. Metal trays going all the way through, didn't seem to implement the noise when this was in operation there. They were sat in quite snugly. And also alongside those main 4 bays, again, not only can you take advantage of standard class and NAS class drives, but there's no compatibility issues, and I believe up to 24 and even 26 TB drives are supported on this. I know the 24s are on the compatibility list. They're generally, Asustor I mean, being one of the more proactive in terms of checking compatibility on their systems. But on the top of this system, we have these ventilation holes. Now, under those ventilation holes are 4 M.2 NVMe slots inside there. They're Gen 4 NVMe. So alongside 4 hard drive bays, you can install 4 NVMe's inside, which is great stuff. Now, a few caveats alongside those NVMe's. Number 1, they are ×1 speed. They are not 4×4 each. Now, whether that is because of lane distribution, I don't think it is so much as it is temperature, because as mentioned, this is all combined inside. And I'll say in terms of the performance I got from those, it was actually pretty darn good. I tapped in via terminal to see what performance numbers I could get, and regardless of the SSD that I tested inside, and I had 4 inside in a mixed group, I got between 1.3 and 1.4 gigabytes per second on all of the drives on a repeated 1 gig test on both read and write. And given Gen times 4 times 1 is going to afford up to 1.8 to 2 gigabytes per second bandwidth on each lane, those numbers are fairly respectable for terminal on a 1 gig test. On top of that, in terms of temperature generation, because they're ×1 speed, as mentioned a long time ago, a previous Asustor review, where Asustor actually contradicted some of the statements I said about temperatures in these systems at ×1 speed. I've got to give them their credit here. That ×1 drive in here with a repeated 1 gig test at between 3 and 5 minutes on all 4 of the SSDs one after the other, the SSDs only got as high as 49 to 50 degrees there. That was repeated 1 gig write tests, and interestingly, when I left the system idle, the temperature was brought down from 48 degrees to 37 degrees in just 90 seconds. And it did that on 2 SSD bays that had no heat sinks attached. I made sure to put heat sinks on 2 of the bays and 2 bays without heat sinks. That was on the non-heat sink quick bays. It was just doing the temperature drop with ambient design of that fan and airflow. Why do I make such a song and dance about USB 4 connectivity on NAS? Well, nice and simple, I've been around the game a while, and I'll say right now that NASes that feature Thunderbolt ports have been stupidly expensive. All the way since 2018, I believe, when QNAP were the first to roll out Thunderbolt NAS, they have always charged a substantial premium. And as time has worn on, although some people have tried to make Thunderbolt NAS devices, very few have succeeded other than QNAP for reasons of presumably Intel payment in the background for certification and just the sheer R&D. Now, things changed in USB 4 or Thunderbolt 4 because they are one and the same. And Because Thunderbolt 4, USB 4 is easier to get compliant with CPUs, it has allowed NAS manufacturers, several of which in 2024, to integrate USB 4 on their systems and therefore be able to not be locked in on traditional network interfaces thanks to CPUs having native Thunderbolt support and therefore allowing for 20, 25 gig, 40 gig connections. And that's why this is important, because this allows this system to be $1,299, give me two 10 gig ports, two 5 gig ports, and two 20 gig Thunderbolt ports that can be used for networking at a price point when competitors, let's say they're known QNAP, have been rolling out solutions with this connectivity, including the Thunderbolt, hitting $3,000 to $4,000, which I hope gives you some context about why $1,299 for this isn't as bad as it might at first feel. Next up, let's talk about noise. You're going to have this system on probably in relative close proximity given all of those network connections, and some of you want to maximising point-to-point connectivity, and I'll tell you right now the noise is not that bad. We've got the system running there next to me. We have 4 drives right now spinning along, and you know, it's in idle. I'll give it a second for you to hear it. If you can hear that fan, you can probably hear some of the noise outside the window. But what about some more intense stuff? Well, we went and set the device up with 4 drives inside in that RAID 5 environment, and after the system had booted up all of its applications and services, we left it in idle, and I'm pleased to say it only went as low as 28 to 31 dBA. After that, we decided to get noisy, so we had the system booting up and performing some early RAID scrubbing and booting up all of the applications and services from scratch. And during that, the system reached an audio level of around 38 to 41 dBA, but it did creep up into the 50s when it was really gun-ho. Now keep in mind, I was doing this taking advantage of traditional Seagate IronWolf 4TB drives, non-pro class. Had I been using drives higher than about 8 or 10 TB, going all the way up to 20 and 22, 24, noise would have certainly amplified higher than that. We are still talking about a metal chassis, and therefore the vibration all the way through the system would have creeped up. But at least for this rather domestic level setup, both in idle and active use, this system left me pretty impressed. Next up, let's talk about that CPU inside. That's what getting the Gen 4 juices flowing, right? It is an AMD embedded Ryzen, the V3C14. This is a 4-core, 8-thread processor running at 2.3 GHz base that can be burst up to 3.8 GHz when needed. And the TDP there between 15 and 25 watts is actually pretty darn good. It's, you know, it's not only a 10 or 15 watt Alder Lakes there, but for a power Gen 4 CPU, it's still pretty darn impressive. With 20 lanes of Gen 4 architecture to play with, there's a lot to like there, but I will say there is no integrated graphics, and I know some of you are going to be really bummed out by that. I get it. When I spoke to Asustor about this, a lot of the issues they encountered when it comes to the Intel Core processors was temperature generation, but also the support of the brands behind those processors. Also, they are running integrated graphics systems like the Lockstore Gen 2 already. It was the same kind of conversation we had with them about the FlashStore and the FlashStore Gen 2, so I'm not going to harp on them too much for that, as long as they maintain their inventory of the Gen 2 system. Another thing I will add is to do with the memory. As mentioned at the beginning, it is ECC error correcting code or error code correction with 16 gig by default, which is pretty good. I mean, I know this is $1,299. I would expect at least 16. But that can go all the way up to 64 gig there if needed. And with the Gen 4 times 1 M2 NVMEs there on a base card, it's also worth highlighting that you can, if you wish, remove that card and install a 10 GBE or their own combo card if you choose to. Just make sure that you use the PCIe switcher application in ADM. Why you would do that when the system already has two 10 gigs and two 5 gigs, I don't know. But still, nonetheless, it's nice to have that flexibility. Next up, let's talk about performance, because that is definitely something on this box that I want to talk about, because this is where a lot of my preconceptions were challenged. Now, let's start easy going. With the hard drives, I had them. Those were Seagate 4TB Iron Wolf drives in a RAID 5 environment, and I performed AJA tests on them. And the AJA performance there, repeated file checks, was between 500 and 600 megabytes per second, give or take. And that was using Minisforum MS01, which is an i9 32 gig RAM Gen 4 system there. And again, 500 to 600, and that was via a single 10G connection there. I didn't bother SMB multi-channeling it for the hard drives. Now, scaling it up, I went and played with the M2 NVMEs. Now, I'd got the M2 NVMEs and put them in a RAID 0 environment there. In order to maximize the connection, I went ahead and had two 10GBE connections set up via SMB multi-channel to see what I could get. In Crystal Disk, we saw full network saturation between 2 and 2.5 gigabytes per second. The 2.4 really, again, Crystal Disk calculate things ever so slightly differently, and 10 gig isn't actually 1000 megabytes per second. There's a little bit over there. When it went to Atto, I did a 256 megabyte test, and slightly more real world there, on a real world in massive quotation marks, with the repeated file there, test at 1.4 to 1.3 gigabytes per second on either read and write side. Then I moved on to that Thunderbolt connection there. That's right, the Thunderbolt 20 gigabits per second there, because it's spread out a Thunderbolt chip there between the two ports. And on Crystal Disk, I was able to achieve, again, 2 to 2.4 gigabytes per second there. Well over 2000 megabytes per second up and down, which is fantastic news. And with Atto Disk Benchmark on a 1 gig test file, I saw between 1.4 and 1.6 gigabytes per second throughput on read and write. All of those numbers, fantastic stuff. But I didn't stop there, because I think it would be fair to say that if this system is absolutely riddled in ports and connections, let's see how many we can actually use at once. Now, full disclaimer, I wasn't able to utilize both USB ports on my setup. It was nothing to do with this system. I just had to take advantage of another adapter because my Minisforum was starting to get a little too hot. So in the end, I went ahead and connected both 10GBE connections and one of the USB 4 connections, a potential 4000 megabytes per second of throughput. Then I set up on one big SSD pool a few different shares. Then I set up Crystal Disk and Atto in different test regimens to try and maximize the theoretical performance that I could hit with this using these synthetic tools. And I'm pleased to say these were my results. When I was taking advantage of Crystal Disk, once I combined all of the shared performance numbers that were happening at once, because of course none of them were going to be able to reach their maximum, it was just about trying to run as many at the same time as possible, I saw 3.1 to 3.5 gigabytes per second. That is massive from this box. In terms of Atto, when I tried Atto Disk Benchmark and I could only run 2 simultaneous instances, I saw 2.8 to 2.5 gigabytes per second on the read and write, and it fluctuated between the two. Those are some fantastic numbers. Now, I didn't have the hardware setup or the time in this review to connect 2 Thunderbolt 4 connections, 2 10GBE connections, and 2 5GBE connections. Hell, I could have used one of the 3 10 gig USBs on this and attached 5 gig adapters to every one of those. The point I'm making is this thing is an absolute powerhouse in terms of network connectivity and bandwidth potential, and I think perhaps when we get to the larger system, such as the 8 or 10 bay, we could really stretch our muscles in terms of performance. Now, the software, I'm going to say, is probably the weakest area of this system. I've got to be relative here. ADM5, the latest version that's arriving with this system, is probably better than any version of ASUSTOR software that's rolled out to date. It feels more responsive, it feels cleaner. The presentation of a lot of the icons is better. They've got rid of a lot of the chaff. And integrations that were in the previous version of ADM, such as Write Once, Read Many support, secure erase, benchmark tools, a wide variety of secure security measure, from two-step authentication to HTTPS locking to the software itself having numerous control systems and file service controls that are off by default. Other little features such as auto media conversions, when you upload high dense media to the system and allows it to automatically convert into separate versions, are there. They tweaked a lot of the weaknesses, I would say, in previous versions of ADM, insofar as let me install too many apps or do too many things at once that would make the system hang. They've not allowed that to happen. There are limits built into when you utilize the software. If you want to install more than 5 apps, it won't let you. When you are trying to do too many things, it will intelligently use the cache in a way that I didn't see previous Asustor NASes use. The applications and services are there, and a huge variety of support of third-party apps are currently available. Also, for example, when you boot the device up for the first time, you can set this system up genuinely in minutes. From the one-click initialization all the way through to the removal of having to create a pull the first time if you don't want to, and a lot of it being automated there in the background and allow you to have your storage set up very, very quickly. I know that's not going to be for everyone, but for those that want simplified, easy to set up storage, this is going to be desirable. On top of that, the tightening of a lot of those defaults, SSH off by default, random ports recommended at setup. Anything you do that doesn't provide redundancy or failover, it will warn you and it will make you agree with it that what you are doing is unsafe before it lets you proceed. The apps and services, as mentioned in previous videos, they don't challenge Synology and QNAP and some of the AAA applications, and certainly some of the things like AI photo recognition. I know their their photo tool, it has improvements coming in, as does their surveillance center application. But a lot of the apps and services on ADM, there still feels like a little bit more of a reliance on third-party apps. That's not the full story. They've got their own apps and services, and then, you know, the majority of them nailing down the fundamentals very, very well. But they're not going to blow you away, and they're certainly not going to challenge Synology quite yet in terms of software. I'm going to be doing a much deeper dive into ADM5 in a separate video, but I just wanted to touch on kind of the bullet points here in this video so you can understand why this software, although I'm still going to say is weaker than the likes of QNAP and Synology, I am going to say it's better than it's ever been. There is a good reason why this device is $1,299 when its predecessor was $500 to $600. They are different beasts. They look the same, but they just aren't. In fact, I said the word predecessor when it isn't really its predecessor. These two are running parallel, should be more than enough. Now, maybe Asustor should have given this a different name. Giving it the same name as the existing LockStore series, I think is going to cause confusion and is going to be something of a comparison issue when people are looking at the LockStore and then suddenly realise there's this other version that seems to be more than double the price. Moreover, the hardware inside this is not going to be for everyone. That lack of transcoding with multimedia there because of the lack of integrated graphics is going to bug some of you. I know that, and hopefully that's why they're going to continue with the Gen 2, or at least come up with some kind of Gen 2.5, who knows. But with a great CPU, Gen 4 architecture on the 20 lanes afforded to it, 10 GBE, 5 GBE, fast speed inside, a huge amount of external bandwidth, USB 4 connectivity for direct connectivity, for editing, for VMs, for just loads and loads of use, and software that, although may not challenge Synology in the near future, I would argue is still better than it's ever been before. There is a lot to love in this system. Just keep in mind that it doesn't have a lot of the client tools that you've seen from some of the other bigger competitors out there. There is a lot included with it, but there is still that slight whiff that they spend a lot more time looking at third-party apps than they do at their own. The ones that they do provide, they nail down the fundamentals, but I'm not going to call them exciting. But that said, as mentioned in other videos, Asustor are one of the few brands that support third-party operating systems installation. If you want to put TrueNAS on this, if you want to put Unraid on this, you can do it and it won't hurt your hardware warranty, which is great news. And stay tuned for a video very, very soon where I'm going to show you how to do it. But when it comes to this system, understand that that $12.99 price tag, when you look at the rest of the market, when you look at Thunderbolt NAS devices, just make sure you look up CPUs like this one, like that embedded Ryzen 3 3000, 16 gig of ECC, 2 times 10 gig, 2 times 5 gig, 2 times USB-C. Look up those factors, then look at $1,299 versus the marketplace. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this. Hopefully the written review will be done in time for this. Should be linked below. Also, if you have found this video helpful, and if you were going to get a hold of this device via some of the retailers I've listed below, please use those links. It won't cost you anything extra, but myself and Eddie, it's just us here at NAS Compares, and we get a small commission, and it allows us to keep doing what we do. But thank you so much for watching. We're going to be doing a full before you buy and should you buy on the whole series of the LockerStore Gen 3. Stay tuned for that. But apart from that, have yourselves a bloody great week.